Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I am here to talk about all of the books that I read in August. August felt like quite a slow reading month with gearing up for school starting. It felt like it was coming in fits and starts, but I actually read a lot more than I thought I did, so I'm really excited to tell you about these. As usual, I'm going to start with the books that I don't have physical copies of, and then I'll get into my physical stack here. So the first book that I finished in August was an audiobook. It came in through the library, and it was the romance novel Ana Maria and the Fox by Liana de la Rosa. This is like I said, a romance novel, in fact, part of a series about the Luna sisters. And the Luna sisters are evacuated from Mexico. Their father is quite high up in the Juarez government in the 1840s, 60s. I'm still not sure even after having read it. But they need to escape the French occupation. So they are sent to London to live with their uncle, who is the Mexican ambassador. So there are really three strains to this novel. The first is introducing you to these three sisters. This novel focuses around the oldest, who is Ana Maria. And then, of course, there will be two more books focusing on Isabel and Gabby. The second strand is, of course, the romance. Ana Maria meets a man whose last name is Fox, who is trying to really break into government. He's had some success, but he tends to support polarizing causes like abolition of the slave trade. Yes, England had technically abolished slavery, but in his opinion, they weren't doing a lot to really discourage this trade with other countries, like those in the Caribbean or the US. And indeed, he is, at the very least, mixed race, if not black himself. While English society was a lot more open than American society at the time, he still isn't entirely welcome in all circles, certainly in the more conservative and more aristocratic circles of government, which is where he really needs a lot of support. Which leads me to the third strand, which is all of the political intrigue that surrounds both Ana Maria and Fox in terms of the cause that he champions, but also the French occupation of Mexico and the danger that that puts the Luna sisters in, as well as the traumatic effects, the emotional effects that it's having on them and their family. Those elements I found really compelling. The romance I thought was very well drawn. It does get very steamy later, but really only for a small section of the book, in keeping with Victorian morale. Most of it is quite clean. The thing that got to me about it was, number one, the narrator's voice, and number two, the writing style. And those combined to make a slight ick factor for me, if I can borrow the colloquialism. The writing style is one of those where Liana de la Rosa is trying to imitate Victorian speak, Victorian language, and it comes off sounding quite hokey at times. Combined with the fact that the narrator, although she was balancing doing three different types of accents between all the various characters, would mispronounce things at times, and that really bothers me just because as a narrator you've been hired to do this job, which means you've had the time to research how that word is pronounced. So overall, I did enjoy this series, but I think I'm going to explore the next two books in physical format so that those writing elements don't bother me quite as much. Another book that I don't have a physical copy of because my mother is borrowing it currently is The Young Clementina by D.E. Stevenson. I have been working my way through D.E. Stevenson's catalog for almost a year now, And I was really intrigued by this one. The description sounded fantastic. This is about a woman who's about my age, somewhere in her 30s, who is an antiquarian librarian living on her own in London. And she's relatively happy with that. However, her sister comes to stay with her for a day or two, and this wreaks havoc in her life, completely upends it, and sends her in a direction that she never imagined. That sounds amazing, and with D.E. Stevenson's very cozy style, I thought I would really enjoy it. This book was kind of a roller coaster, though, in terms of enjoyment, in that it starts in a very strange style. It's very unusual for D.E. Stevenson, which is that our narrator is describing her childhood and the events that have led her to her current point to an absolute stranger. She is writing them down as though she's talking to a woman that she met on a bus once in London. And she doesn't even know this woman's name, so she names her Claire in her head. And she's describing all of these events to Claire as though Claire is her therapist. So a very unusual style to use for D.E. Stevenson, but I thought, okay, I could be able to get along with this. Let's see where this goes. Then the twist happens in the middle, and those unexpected events come into our main character's life. And I started loving it. I started loving the growth and the characters and how they developed together. I thought it was really, really lovely. And then part 4 happened, and to me, that last section completely undermined all of the growth that was set up in sections 2 and 3. I really did not agree with it. I really did not enjoy it. So that was rather disappointing. So overall, I am going to hold on to it because it is intriguing with all of those elements combining in one book. But I wouldn't say that it was my favorite D.E. Stevenson. If you've read that one, let me know in the comments if you had the same problem I did. If you haven't read it, maybe don't glance at the comments just yet, because we may get into spoiler territory there. And then finally, I had an ebook hold come in for me from the library, which was Once Upon a Broken Heart by Stephanie Garber. I put this on hold on a complete whim. I've been seeing it all over BookTube and Bookstagram, and people just swoon over this series. This is part of a series. It's a fantasy series. I believe it's young adult. It takes place in, obviously, an alternate world where almost instead of saints, there are fates, but not in a Greek myth sense. Fates in terms of the Prince of Hearts. And he has a chapel where the brokenhearted can go, confess all of their problems that they're having, and perhaps he might consent to help them. However, as you can imagine from that, his help rarely turns out the way you think it's going to. Evangeline Fox does just that. Her lover, her former boyfriend, is about to be married to her stepsister, and she is devastated by this, and so she goes to his chapel and confesses to the heir what's going on, and it turns out he does appear, and he offers to help her with her predicament in exchange for 3 kisses from him, where and when being of his choosing. And so she agrees. And this sets up a turn of events that takes us all over this world. There are twists and turns galore. I can see where some people find it quite hokey. I can see where people find the ending, at least of the first one, a little bit underwhelming. But I really enjoyed it. It was just fun. It was fun and delightful and whimsical and just really enjoyable. So I do have the second 2 on hold, so hopefully those come in the next few months as well. Then I get to the physical books that I read, and the first 2 I have been working on for quite a while. The first of those is Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope. I had been listening to this since May, I think, on audiobook, but I finally finished it. It is quite long, as are most of Anthony Trollope's books, so listening to it in 15 or 20-minute chunks every day made it take a very long time. But oh my gosh, it was so worth it. I so enjoyed this book. It's the first book in his Palliser series. The Barsetshire series focuses on the church. These focus on politics. That's not to say that in this book, Westminster is central to all of the characters, or that you need to understand English government to be able to enjoy these. This book centers around Alice Vavasor, who has a terrible time in love. She had been engaged to her cousin George at one point, and then decided against it, broke it off with him, and we follow her deciding what she's going to do with her life. Who, if any, is she going to marry and dedicate her life to? And we see that through several other women around her as well, like her cousin Kate, who is George's brother, their aunt, I believe, Mrs. Greenough, and I believe Lady Glencora is another cousin of theirs somehow, or at least a very dear friend. And we see their marriages or marriage dilemmas, and really investigates not quite feminism, but just the reality of being a Victorian woman. And I loved all of these characters. I could picture all of them so clearly. I grew to love them even when they were making awful decisions. And I really hope the rest are just as good, and that we get to see these characters even more in the subsequent books, because this was just delightful. Another book I worked on for ages, and I'll explain why, is Purlie Victorious by Ossie Davis. The reason this took me so long is that I was watching the play. It was recently performed on Broadway with Leslie Odom Jr., as is on the cover, and that was broadcast on PBS here in the late spring, and it's still available on their website. So I was watching that with a friend, but due to various life events, it took us a couple of weeks to watch the final half of the play. So now I can say I have finally read it. I cannot rave enough about this play. I went into it knowing absolutely nothing. It's about Reverend Purlie, who comes back to his hometown where his sister and brother-in-law are still living, determined to win back a church that is on this town's land. And it was left to one of their cousins, I believe, or cousin B through their aunt. However, both their aunt and cousin B have since died. But the white man who runs the town is not going to just honor the will and hand it over. He is a truly despicable character, and yet so believable, which is what makes him so despicable, is that he's so real. And so they devise a scheme to have someone impersonate Cousin B and smooth talk this old man into handing back the church. And not only comedy ensues from that, but such an incredible look at race relations in America to this day. It was written in 1961. Sometimes you can't tell, at least I couldn't tell when watching it, whether it was supposed to be set in 1961 or the 1870s. It still felt like we were in the Reconstruction at times. And it still holds true today. That's why they revived it on Broadway, which is wonderful that this play exists, but also really frightening that we're still having some of these issues. What I especially loved is the language that Ossie Davis gives to Purlie. It is gorgeous. It is poetry. There is a poetry and a musicality in a certain style of preaching that you will find typically in Black churches that this play makes wonderful use of. It is gorgeous. It is poignant. There is a whole section where he bemoans the fact that why is it that we are still having to endure situations like this. That is so powerful. I highly recommend that you see it or listen to it, but if you can't, at the very least read it. Then I read How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. Ruth Goodman is one of my favorite historians, and you may have seen her on television. She does a lot of documentaries like Tudor Farm, Victorian Farm, those sorts of shows, which is why I love her books so much, is that if she mentions that people did something, not only do you know that she has verified that this was common practice, but she has tried it. She has tried it and lived it. Sometimes her whole family has lived it just for her to experience what that would have been like over long periods of time. That was especially fascinating in her book, How to Be a Tudor, but this one was also fantastic, and it takes you through the Victorian day. So it details what waking up would have been like, who would have woken up when, what their duties would have been right away, what their morning wash would have been like, how people would have gotten dressed, how that would have changed over time or based on gender. Going to school, what would the mid-morning meal look like, all the way to going to bed at night. If you're at all interested in history or the Victorian period, Victober is coming up, so that would be a fantastic time to pick this up as a companion piece. And then finally, I read Island Queen by Vanessa Riley. I have been meaning to read this book for a couple of years, so I'm so glad that I finally did. This details the life of Dorothy Kirwan Thomas, who was a Black woman in the late 1700s, who was raised in the Caribbean. She was raised as a slave initially. Eventually, she was not just freed, but she bought her own manumission and thus also freed a lot of her family members, which was just incredible, the amount of work that she put in to make that happen. And then eventually she worked her way up to be one of the greatest landowners in the Caribbean and traveled to England and met these incredibly high up and important people. And yet we don't really hear about her, which is of course why Vanessa Riley wrote this book. She wrote it really beautifully. I really enjoyed her style. Dorothy Kirwan Thomas is an amazing and important woman to read about, so I loved learning more about her. However, I will give two warnings. Certainly, as you may have gathered, there are massive trigger warnings in here. A lot of what she went through was fairly horrific, and those sections are very, very hard to read. But the other thing was she had many, many men in her life over the years, and because she never really fixed the root causes within herself, the same patterns tended to emerge in those relationships as well. And just as she got tired of having to go through the same thing over and over and over again, so did I as a reader. I don't know if that was the intended effect, but that would be my one complaint about this book. However, Vanessa Riley couldn't do anything about that really, because that was just how Dorothy's life worked out. So I would highly encourage you to read this if you've been thinking about it and haven't been sure if it's going to be for you. Definitely check it out, but do bear those trigger warnings in mind. So those are all of the books that I finished in August. Of course, I started Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens, but as that is also a massive book, and I'm mainly listening to it on audiobook, it is going to take a very long time. So that will probably show up next month in my September wrap-up. Let me know down below what some of your favorite August reads were, or what you're excited to read this upcoming month. And until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye, everyone.